and we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding.
Containment is best known as the Cold War policy of the United States and its allies to prevent the spread of communism abroad. A component of the Cold War, this policy was a response to a series of moves by the Soviet Union to enlarge communist influence in Eastern Europe, China, Korea, Africa, and Vietnam. The United States started producing propaganda in order to combat the communist influence spreading.
NASA evolved from National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics in 1958 as a result of the space race between the U.S. and Soviet Union. NACA was originally founded in 1915.
On June the 30th, 1948, the Allied powers began a massive airlift into the city of Berlin. It was their answer to a road and rail blockade set up by the Soviet Union 2 months earlier, and it shook the world by its daring and effectiveness. As part of the post-war settlement, the former German capital had been divided into 4 sections. The British, Americans and French were in the western areas, the Soviets occupied the east. But Berlin itself was inside Soviet-occupied territory, which meant that all food supplies and any other kind of material needed to keep life going had to pass through their checkpoints before it could reach the Allied zones. The blockade was an effort to drive the West out of the city. The airlift was to make sure it could survive, and it worked. As the American Secretary of State George Marshall put it, "We are in Berlin to stay. The city will be kept alive." To underline the point, in one 24-hour period, American planes delivered 7,000 tons of supplies on 895 flights.
In 1957, the U.S. was challenged to launch the first satellite into space for the International Geophysical Year.
During the Cold War, the struggle for dominance between the world powers was expressed via proxy wars, psychological warfare, propaganda, espionage, and technological competition such as the space race.
In 1957, the U.S. launched Project Vanguard, which intended to launch the first satellite into Earth orbit with a Vanguard rocket. However, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union beat the U.S. to this task by launching the first satellite into space known as Sputnik.
Transmitting a code, not just a beep signal for radio listening.
Yes, it's quite possible that it's transmitting a code, but we don't realize what the code is.
Dr. Newell, what about the vital question that everybody is thinking about? Why and how did the Russians beat us to the draw?
Well, in answer to that, I'd like to say a few introductory words first. When we began our program, the planners and the engineers and the scientists drew up a schedule for themselves which consisted of a number of logical engineering steps to lead to the final objective. Now, this schedule placed them in a race with time because they had to get the satellite up during IGY. And naturally, we can assume that the Soviets did the same thing, and they were in a race with time also with the same deadline. It therefore seems quite reasonable that one or the other would get a satellite up first.
Was it a surprise to you that they got there first?
Well, it was something of a surprise, and naturally, since this generates a certain amount of scientific rivalry, something of a disappointment to us, but this does not lessen our admiration of what the Soviets have done.
The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics appointed Geifert Stever, who consulted the working group led by Werner von Braun to explore non-military space agency. On January 31st, 1958, Explorer 1 became the first U.S. satellite launched into space. On March 5th, 1958, PSAC Chairman James Gilman urged Organization for Civil Space Programs. In response, on July 16, 1958, the NASA Act was created.
Members of the NACA staff, this is my first opportunity to greet you as Deputy Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It is a very great pleasure to introduce the Administrator of NASA, Dr. T. Keith Glennis.
Thank you, Hugh. We have come to a new day. NACA is to become part of a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first man in space aboard the Freedom 7. On February 20, 1962, John Glenn became the first American launched into orbit aboard Friendship 7. On March 23, 1965, Gemini 3 was flown by Gus Grimson and John Young, in which they studied the effect of weightlessness. Shortly after noon on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated as he rode in a motorcade through Daley Plaza in downtown Dallas.
A flash from Dallas. Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. I will repeat with the greatest regret, two priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
It was later discovered that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sniper who assassinated John F. Kennedy. Historians have postulated that after a period of true world wars followed by the uncertainty of the Cold War nuclear age, American families found stability and protection within suburban Navy towns. This marked the birth of the typical American family.
The Kitchen Debate was the first high-level meeting between Soviet and U.S. leaders since the Geneva Convention in 1955. The Kitchen Debate was a series of exchanges between the U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the opening American National Exhibition at Solkiny Park in Moscow.
The Apollo-Soyuz test project took place in July of 1975. Its primary purpose was to ease the tensions between the two world superpowers, the U.S. and Soviet Union, also known as Detente. This marked the end of the space race. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy launched the Apollo program.
If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred.
In 1993, the International Space Station was created by merging the U.S. Space Station Freedom, the Russian MIRZ, the European Columbus Station, and the Japanese Kibu.
In February 2010, Obama called for a manned mission to an asteroid by 2025 and a mission to Mars by mid-2030s.
So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them.